Naruto is often remembered as a story that explains everything. Eventually, a world where mysteries are introduced only to be resolved later, where powers are given origins, and histories are slowly uncovered until the system feels complete. But if you look more closely, there are moments where that sense of completeness begins to fade, where certain details exist without ever being fully acknowledged, quietly suggesting that the world is not as stable as it appears. One of the simplest examples of this is how early in the series, chakra is treated almost like stamina, something that runs out with physical exhaustion. Yet, as the story progresses, it begins to behave less like energy and more like something abstract, something that can expand, evolve, and even be inherited in ways that no longer feel tied to the body at all. The shift is never directly addressed, but it changes everything about how power is understood. It is easy to assume that the Sharingan's ability to copy techniques is purely visual, that it simply observes and replicates what it sees. But this raises a quiet contradiction that is never fully explained. Many jutsu require not just hand signs, but precise chakra control and specific training that should not be instantly reproducible. And yet, the Sharingan allows its user to bypass that entire process, suggesting that it is not just copying movement, but understanding intent, flow, and structure in a way that borders on something deeper than perception. It is less like seeing and more like knowing, as if the eye itself contains a form of knowledge that does not belong to normal experience. There is also something unsettling about the way shadow clones function when you stop thinking of them as simple duplicates. Each clone carries not just physical form, but memory, experience, and awareness, all of which return to the original when the clone disappears. This means that Naruto is not just training faster than others. He is living multiple timelines of experience simultaneously and merging them into one consciousness. Over time, this would not just accelerate growth. It would fundamentally change how a person perceives reality, because their sense of time and experience would no longer be linear. And yet, this psychological impact is never deeply explored, even though it suggests a mind that should feel very different from anyone else's. The idea of Jinchuriki is often framed as a burden, something isolating and painful. But there is a detail that quietly shifts that perspective into something darker. The tailed beasts are not just sources of power. They are conscious entities with memory, emotion, and will, meaning that every Jinchuriki is never truly alone, even in isolation. They are constantly sharing their existence with something ancient and aware, something that experiences the world alongside them. This raises a strange question about identity, because over time, the boundary between host and beast becomes less clear, suggesting that a Jinchuriki is not just a person carrying power, but a fusion of two perspectives, that are slowly learning to coexist. Even something as simple as substitution, jutsu, begins to feel strange when examined closely. It is treated as a basic technique, something almost every shinobi can perform. Yet the speed and precision required to replace oneself with another object at the exact moment of impact implies a level of timing and awareness that borders on impossibility. The series never slows down enough to question it, but the more you think about it, the more it feels like a technique that should be far more difficult than it is presented, quietly hinting that the baseline abilities of shinobi are already operating at a level far beyond what is considered normal. There is also a quiet inconsistency in how time is experienced during combat. Certain moments stretch unnaturally, allowing characters to think, analyze, and react within fractions of a second, while at other times, events unfold with normal pacing. This suggests that perception itself changes under pressure, that highly trained shinobi are not just faster physically, but capable of processing reality differently when necessary. It is never explained directly, but it creates the sense that combat is not just a physical exchange, but a shift in awareness, where time itself feels less fixed. The concept of chakra nature transformation introduces another subtle implication that is easy to overlook. Each individual is said to have an affinity, a natural alignment with a specific element, but the existence of advanced users who can manipulate multiple natures suggests that this affinity is not a strict limitation, but more of a starting point. This raises the question of whether limitations in the shinobi world are truly fixed, or simply accepted as fixed, because most people never push far enough to discover otherwise. In that sense, the system may not be as restrictive as it appears, but rather shaped by expectation, as much as by actual constraint. There is something equally unsettling about the way reanimation works, particularly in how it preserves the personality and memory of the deceased. These are not empty shells or controlled puppets in the traditional sense. They are complete individuals, aware of their past, capable of independent thought, yet still bound to the will of another. This creates a contradiction where autonomy and control exist at the same time, forcing the reanimated to experience their own actions without being able to fully stop them. It is a state that is never deeply explored, but implies a level of psychological tension far beyond what is shown. Even the concept of ninja tools carries an interesting implication when you consider how rarely they are relied upon compared to jutsu. In a world where tools can be enhanced, combined with chakra, and used strategically, they often take a secondary role to abilities that come from within. This suggests that the shinobi world places more value on internal power than external innovation, prioritizing personal strength over technological advancement. Over time, this creates a system where progress is tied to individuals rather than ideas, which may explain why power becomes so unevenly distributed. there is also a subtle detail in how villages function politically that is easy to overlook. While each village has its own leadership and structure, much of their stability depends on a small number of exceptionally powerful individuals. This creates a fragile balance where peace is not maintained by systems or agreements alone, but by the presence of individuals capable of enforcing it. When those individuals disappear, the stability they provided often disappears with them, suggesting that the system is less resilient than it appears on the surface. The existence of forbidden jutsu raises another quiet contradiction. These techniques are labeled as dangerous, often due to their cost or their ethical implications, yet their very existence implies that someone had to create them in the first place. This means that the shinobi world is constantly producing individuals willing to push beyond accepted limits, experimenting with abilities that are not meant to exist. The label forbidden does not prevent their creation. It only acknowledges that they have already been created, suggesting that the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable power is constantly being tested. And perhaps most quietly unsettling of all is the idea that many of the world's greatest conflicts are not caused by misunderstanding, but by understanding taken too far. Characters like Madara, Obito, and Nagato do not act out of ignorance, but out of conclusions they have reached after seeing the world clearly. This creates a strange tension where the deeper someone understands the system, the more likely they are to reject it, suggesting that knowledge itself can lead to instability rather than resolution. And when all of these details are placed together, when they are allowed to sit without being simplified or explained away, a different version of the Naruto world begins to emerge. Not one that is broken, but one that is less certain than it first appears, where rules exist but are not always complete, and where the deeper you look, the more it begins to feel like something is slightly off beneath the surface. There are many parts of Naruto that feel familiar simply because they are shown so often, repeated through battles, training, and quiet moments in between. But familiarity has a way of hiding the more unusual details. When something is seen enough times, it stops being questioned, even if it never fully made sense to begin with. One example of this is how chakra control is described as something precise and difficult, requiring intense focus and discipline. Yet many high-level techniques are executed in the middle of chaotic battles, under pressure that should make that level of control almost impossible. This suggests that for experienced shinobi, control is no longer something they actively think about, but something that has become instinctive, almost automatic, as if their body is operating on a level separate from conscious effort. There is also something subtle about the way genjutsu is resisted. It is often said that disrupting one's own chakra flow can break an illusion. But this raises an interesting implication about awareness. To break genjutsu, a shinobi must first realize they are under it, which means they must detect a flaw in their own perception. This suggests that experienced shinobi are constantly analyzing reality itself, not just reacting to what they see, but questioning whether what they see is even real. Over time, this would create a mindset where perception is never fully trusted, where even your own senses are treated as something that can betray you. The Byakugan, despite being one of the most powerful visual abilities, is often overshadowed. But when examined closely, it introduces its own strange implications. The ability to see chakra networks, to observe the internal flow of energy within another person, means that users are constantly aware of things that others cannot perceive. They do not just see movement or expression, they see intention forming before it is acted upon, as chakra shifts in preparation. This creates a form of awareness that is not based on reaction, but anticipation at a level that borders on inevitability. There is a quiet inconsistency in how summoning works that is rarely addressed. Creatures from entirely different environments, sometimes vastly different in scale, can be brought into battle instantly. Yet the nature of where they come from is never fully explored. These summons are not illusions, and they are not created on the spot, which means there are entire ecosystems existing somewhere else, separate from the main world, yet fully connected to it through contracts. The idea that such worlds exist alongside the shinobi world, but are almost never discussed, adds a layer of depth that feels intentionally left unexplored. Even something as simple as body flicker techniques begins to feel unusual when you consider how they are used. Shinobi appear to move almost instantaneously across short distances, often vanishing and reappearing before the eye can follow. Yet this is not treated as teleportation. It is described as speed, but at a level where the distinction between movement and disappearance becomes unclear. This suggests that the physical limits of the body, at least for trained shinobi, are already far beyond what the world acknowledges directly. There is also an interesting detail in how pain is portrayed. Many characters continue to fight despite injuries that should be incapacitating, maintaining focus and control even when their bodies are clearly failing. This is often attributed to willpower, but it also suggests that experienced shinobi develop a relationship with pain that allows them to separate it from their actions. Over time, pain becomes something observed rather than something that dictates behavior, creating a mindset where the body's signals are no longer fully trusted. The concept of seals introduces another layer of quiet complexity. Sealing techniques are capable of containing immense power, storing objects, chakra, and even living beings within confined spaces that do not behave according to normal physical rules. This implies a level of manipulation over space itself, yet it is treated as just another category of jutsu, rarely given the same attention as more visible abilities. The deeper implications of this, that space can be altered, compressed, or redefined, remain mostly in the background. There is also something worth noticing about how information spreads in the shinobi world. Despite the existence of multiple villages and constant conflict, certain techniques, abilities, and even knowledge about individuals seem to travel quickly and accurately. This suggests an underlying network of intelligence and observation that is far more efficient than it appears, one that operates quietly, ensuring that information rarely stays isolated for long. The ranking system, while presented as a clear hierarchy, also carries its own inconsistencies. Genin, Chunin, and Jonin classifications are meant to represent skill and responsibility. Yet there are numerous cases where individuals exceed the expectations of their rank or operate far beyond it. This suggests that the system is less about defining true ability and more about maintaining order, creating categories that are easier to manage, even if they do not perfectly reflect reality. There is a subtle detail in how teamwork is emphasized throughout the series. Shinobi are trained to operate in squads, to rely on coordination and shared strategy. Yet the most impactful individuals often act alone. This creates a contradiction where the system promotes cooperation, but its most successful outcomes are driven by individuals who move beyond that structure, suggesting that teamwork is foundational, but not always the final stage. The existence of Kekkei Genkai also introduces a quiet tension within the system. These abilities are inherited, tied to bloodlines rather than effort, which creates an imbalance that cannot be corrected through training alone. While the world acknowledges this, it rarely addresses the long-term implications of a system where certain individuals are born with advantages that others can never reach, no matter how much they improve. And when these details are considered together, a pattern begins to form, not one of inconsistency, but of something more subtle. The shinobi world functions, but not always in the way it presents itself. There are layers beneath its structure, details that are accepted without being fully examined, and systems that work not because they are perfect, but because they are rarely questioned deeply enough to reveal where they begin to fall apart. Some abilities in Naruto are presented as advanced, rare, or difficult to master, but still grounded within the logic of the world, explained as extensions of chakra control or lineage. But there are others that feel slightly different, abilities that are accepted as part of the system, yet when examined more closely, begin to stretch that system in ways that are never fully addressed. They are not treated as impossible, but they introduce effects that quietly challenge what should be possible, creating small fractures that become more noticeable the longer you think about them. One of the clearest examples of this is the flying Reijin technique. It is described as teleportation, a method of instantly moving between marked locations. Yet the implications of this ability are far greater than the series ever fully explores. Unlike speed-based movement, this is not a matter of traveling faster than perception, but bypassing space entirely, ignoring distance as a limitation. If distance can be removed so completely, then positioning, timing, and even the concept of travel itself begin to lose meaning. And yet, it is treated as a highly advanced but contained technique, rather than something that fundamentally alters how the world should function. There is also something unusual about chakra absorption abilities, particularly in how they interact with other techniques. Chakra is often described as the foundation of all jutsu, the energy that fuels everything. But certain abilities allow it to be removed, redirected, or nullified entirely. This creates a situation where techniques can be erased mid-execution, as if they never existed at all. It raises the question of whether jutsu are truly real in the physical sense, or if they are temporary constructs held together only as long as their chakra remains intact. The Susanoo introduces another quiet contradiction. It is a manifestation of chakra shaped into a massive, protective form, yet it behaves with a solidity that goes beyond energy alone. It can block physical attacks, interact with the environment, and even wield weapons, all while being described as a projection rather than a physical entity. This blurs the line between what is material and what is not, suggesting that chakra, when refined enough, can cross that boundary entirely. There is also something subtle in how sensory abilities work. Certain shinobi are capable of detecting chakra signatures across vast distances, identifying individuals not just by presence, but by the unique quality of their energy. This implies that every person has a distinct signature that can be recognized without visual confirmation, almost like an identity that exists beyond physical appearance. It suggests that individuality in Naruto is not just external, but something embedded within chakra itself. The concept of weight manipulation, particularly through techniques like onoki's, introduces another layer of inconsistency. The ability to reduce or increase weight at will should have massive implications for movement, combat, and even environmental interaction. Yet it is rarely explored beyond specific uses. If gravity can be altered so directly, then many of the limitations that define physical combat should no longer apply in the same way. There is also something worth noticing about the way clones are used beyond shadow clones. Standard clones are described as illusions, lacking physical form, yet they are often used in ways that influence perception and strategy in very real ways. This creates a layered battlefield where not everything that is seen exists, and not everything that exists is immediately visible, forcing shinobi to constantly operate within uncertainty. The idea of chakra constructs, such as weapons or barriers, introduces another subtle shift. These constructs are formed from energy, yet they behave with consistency and durability, capable of interacting with the physical world as if they were solid objects. This suggests that chakra is not just a fuel, but a substance that can take on properties far beyond what is initially implied. There is also an interesting detail in how speed is portrayed at higher levels. Certain characters move so quickly that they appear to disappear. Yet this is still categorized as movement rather than teleportation. The distinction becomes difficult to define because at that level, speed begins to mimic abilities that should belong to entirely different categories. The concept of space-time ninjutsu as a whole introduces perhaps the most significant contradiction. Techniques that allow movement between dimensions, the creation of separate spaces, or the storage of objects in alternate locations, all suggest that reality itself is more flexible than the system acknowledges. These are not small adjustments to existing rules. They are complete redefinitions of how space is meant to function. There is also something subtle in how chakra exhaustion is portrayed. Early in the series, running out of chakra is treated as a serious limitation. Yet later, characters operate at levels where that limitation seems less consistent. This shift is never directly explained, but it changes the way endurance is perceived. Even the idea of combining chakra natures, creating entirely new forms of energy through Kekkei Genkai, suggests that the system is not fixed, but capable of producing entirely new categories of ability when conditions align. This implies that what is known is only a portion of what is possible. And when all of these abilities are viewed together, they begin to form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. The system appears structured, but it allows for abilities that quietly contradict that structure, creating a world where the rules exist, but are constantly being stretched, redefined, or bypassed in ways that are accepted without ever being fully questioned. There are moments in Naruto where the focus shifts away from battles, abilities, and individual power, and instead lingers, almost unintentionally, on the structure of the world itself. These moments are easy to overlook because they are rarely emphasized, often appearing only in brief scenes or background details. But when they are examined more closely, they begin to suggest something much larger. The shinobi world is presented as a collection of villages, nations, and alliances. Yet there are hints scattered throughout the story that this visible structure is only part of what actually exists. That beneath the surface, there are systems, histories, and connections that are never fully explained, but are constantly influencing everything that happens. One of the clearest examples of this is the way villages function beyond their military role. Each hidden village is known primarily as a center for shinobi, a place where missions are assigned and power is maintained. But these villages also act as economic hubs, political entities, and cultural centers, all at the same time. They are responsible not only for defense, but for stability, trade, and internal order. Yet most of this is rarely explored directly. This creates the sense that there is an entire layer of society operating quietly in the background, one that supports the visible world of shinobi without ever being fully acknowledged. There is also something subtle about the relationship between the hidden villages and the larger nations they belong to. While villages like Konoha appear to hold significant power, they are still technically part of a broader political structure, one that includes feudal lords and governing systems that exist outside of shinobi influence. This creates an unusual balance where military power and political authority are not always aligned, suggesting that the true structure of control in the world is more complex than it appears on the surface. The existence of neutral territories and smaller, less powerful regions introduces another layer that is often left unexplored. Not every place in the world is dominated by a major village, and yet these smaller regions continue to exist, navigating a landscape where larger powers can influence them at any time. This creates a quiet tension, a sense that the world is not evenly balanced, but shaped by influence that extends beyond direct conflict. There is also an interesting detail in how missions are assigned and carried out. Shinobi are often sent on tasks that range from simple errands to high-risk operations. But the system that determines these missions operates with a level of efficiency that is rarely questioned. Information is gathered, threats are assessed, and decisions are made quickly, suggesting the presence of an underlying network that processes and distributes knowledge far more effectively than is ever shown directly. The existence of ANBU introduces another hidden layer within the villages themselves. These operatives function in secrecy, carrying out missions that are not meant to be known by the general population or even by other shinobi. Their presence implies that every village maintains an internal system of control and surveillance, one that operates alongside the more visible structure, ensuring stability through means that are not openly acknowledged. There is also something worth noticing about the way history is preserved, or in some cases, not preserved. Certain events are well documented and widely known, while others remain obscure, mentioned only briefly, or not at all. This selective preservation of history suggests that information is not just recorded, but curated, shaped in a way that influences how the present understands the past. The relationship between clans and villages introduces another layer of complexity. Clans carry their own histories, abilities, and identities, often predating the villages themselves, yet they exist within a system that requires them to align with a larger structure. This creates a balance between individuality and unity, one that is not always stable, as seen in conflicts that arise when clan interests diverge from those of the village. There is also an underlying question about how knowledge is distributed. Techniques, strategies, and even basic training methods are passed down through generations. Yet certain information remains restricted, accessible only to specific individuals or groups. This controlled flow of knowledge suggests that power in the shinobi world is not just about ability, but about access. The existence of organizations outside the village system, such as Akatsuki, introduces another dimension entirely. These groups operate independently, without allegiance to any single nation, yet they are capable of influencing the world on a massive scale. Their presence suggests that the village system, while dominant, is not absolute, and that alternative structures can emerge and function alongside it. There is also something subtle in how communication occurs across distances. Messages, intelligence, and coordination between villages and individuals happen with a speed and reliability that implies the existence of systems that are never fully shown, but are essential to maintaining the world's structure. The role of civilians, while often in the background, adds another layer to this hidden world. Not everyone is a shinobi, and yet the lives of civilians are deeply affected by the actions of those who are. This creates a dual reality, where one part of the population lives within the visible system of missions and conflict, while another exists within its consequences. And when all of these elements are considered together, they begin to reveal something that is easy to miss when focusing only on the main narrative. The shinobi world is not just what is shown on the surface. It is supported by layers of structure, systems that operate quietly, histories that are selectively remembered, and connections that are rarely explained but constantly present. It is a world that feels complete, but only because much of what sustains it remains unseen, existing just beneath the surface, shaping everything without ever fully revealing itself. There is a tendency to view the shinobi of Naruto primarily through what they do, the battles they fight, the techniques they master, the roles they fulfill within their villages. But beneath all of that, there is a quieter layer that is rarely addressed directly. The psychology of a shinobi is not something that is often explained, yet it is constantly present, shaping every decision, every reaction, and every outcome in ways that are easy to overlook. Because from a very early point in their lives, shinobi are not just trained in skill. They are trained in how to think, how to feel, and perhaps, most importantly, how to suppress what would normally define a person outside of that system. One of the most subtle but important details is how early this conditioning begins. Children enter the academy at a young age, learning not just techniques, but discipline, hierarchy, and the idea that their value is tied to their effectiveness. This creates a mindset where identity is closely linked to performance, where success is measured by capability rather than individuality. Over time, this begins to reshape how shinobi see themselves, because they are not growing up in an environment that encourages self-expression, but in one that prioritizes function. There is also something unusual about the way emotions are handled. Shinobi are not taught to eliminate emotion entirely, but they are trained to control it to a degree that often borders on detachment. fear, hesitation, grief, all of these are treated as obstacles that must be managed rather than experienced. This creates a psychological state where emotions are not absent, but contained, existing beneath the surface without always being fully processed. And when those emotions do emerge, they often do so in ways that feel intense and overwhelming because they have been suppressed for so long. The concept of teamwork introduces another layer to this psychological structure. Shinobi are trained to operate in squads, to trust their teammates, and to rely on coordination. Yet at the same time, they are expected to make decisions that may put those same teammates at risk. This creates a tension between connection and responsibility, where bonds are encouraged, but must be set aside when necessary. Over time, this leads to a mindset where relationships are both essential and fragile, valued but never fully secure. There is also an interesting detail in how loss is treated. Death is not rare in the shinobi world, and yet it is often accepted with a level of composure that feels unusual. This is not because shinobi do not feel grief, but because they are conditioned to continue despite it. The expectation is not to stop or to withdraw, but to move forward, to carry the loss without allowing it to disrupt function. This creates a form of resilience, but it also means that grief is rarely given space to fully resolve. The idea of identity becomes even more complex when considering roles such as ANBU or root operatives. These individuals are not just trained to suppress emotion, but to suppress individuality entirely, becoming extensions of a system rather than distinct people. Their actions are guided by orders, their identities shaped by function, and over time, the distinction between who they are and what they are assigned to do begins to fade. There is also something subtle in how ambition is portrayed. Many shinobi strive to become stronger, to achieve recognition, or to reach positions of influence. Yet this ambition is often shaped by the system itself. The goals they pursue are not always self-defined, but influenced by expectations, by what the world values, and by what is considered necessary for survival. This creates a situation where ambition is both personal and imposed, a mixture of individual desire and systemic pressure. The concept of fear is handled in an equally nuanced way. Shinobi are not immune to fear, but they are trained to function despite it, to act even when the outcome is uncertain. Over time, this leads to a relationship with fear that is less about avoidance and more about management, where fear becomes something that exists alongside action rather than preventing it. There is also an underlying question about how shinobi perceive themselves in relation to others. The constant exposure to conflict, to hierarchy, and to evaluation creates a mindset where comparison is unavoidable. Strength is measured, ranked, and observed, leading to a sense of identity that is often tied to where one stands relative to others. The existence of missions introduces another psychological element, one that is often overlooked. Each mission carries risk, uncertainty, and the possibility of failure. Yet shinobi are expected to approach them with composure and focus. This repeated exposure to high-stakes situations shapes how they perceive risk itself, making what would be considered extreme in other contexts feel routine. There is also something worth noting about how trust is developed and maintained. In a world where deception is a skill and information is often hidden, trust becomes something that must be built carefully, often through shared experience rather than assumption. This creates relationships that are strong, but also tested constantly by the nature of the world itself. And when all of these elements are considered together, a clearer picture begins to form. The shinobi world does not just produce skilled individuals. It produces a specific kind of mindset, one shaped by discipline, control, and constant exposure to situations that require adaptation. It is a psychology built not for comfort, but for function, one that allows individuals to operate within a system that demands more than what would normally be expected. And beneath everything else, beneath the abilities and the conflicts, it is this quiet, psychological structure that holds the world together, even as it places a weight on those who exist within it that is rarely fully acknowledged. Power in Naruto is almost always framed as something to pursue, something to refine, something that defines growth and determines outcome. But there is a quieter pattern that sits beneath all of it, one that is easy to miss because it is never directly stated. The more power a character gains, the more something else begins to shift alongside it, something less visible than strength, but just as important. It is not simply exhaustion, and it is not always physical. It is a gradual change in how the individual exists within the world, a cost that does not always appear immediately, but accumulates over time in ways that are difficult to reverse. At first, power feels straightforward, something earned through effort, through experience, through survival. But as it continues to grow, as it begins to move beyond ordinary limits, it starts to reshape the individual in ways that are far more subtle than strength alone. One of the first shifts occurs in how effort relates to outcome, and this change is quiet enough that it rarely draws attention. Early in the series, every action feels deliberate. Every technique carries weight, and every mistake has visible consequence, reinforcing the idea that power must be managed carefully. But as characters grow stronger, those relationships begin to loosen. Techniques that once required precision become instinctive. Actions that once carried risk become routine. And over time, this creates a subtle disconnect between effort and result, where the individual begins to operate in a way that no longer reflects the same level of constraint as everyone else around them, as if the world itself has become easier to move through, not because it has changed, but because they no longer experience its resistance in the same way. This shift does not stay contained within combat. It begins to affect perception itself, shaping how the world is interpreted and understood. When actions no longer carry the same cost, when outcomes can be achieved with less resistance, the sense of limitation that once grounded decision-making begins to fade. Challenges that once required careful thought become simplified, and risks that once demanded hesitation become manageable. Over time, this alters how reality is approached, because the individual is no longer reacting to the world in the same way as others, but moving through it with a level of control that changes how difficulty is perceived. There is also a quiet but consistent change in how relationships are experienced as power grows. Strength creates distance, not always intentionally, but almost inevitably, because as an individual becomes more capable, their experiences begin to diverge from those around them. The challenges they face are different. The scale of their decisions expands, and the consequences of their actions extend far beyond what others are used to navigating. This creates a gap in understanding that is not always visible, but is always present, where others can observe what they do, but cannot fully relate to how they experience it. Over time, this leads to a form of isolation that is not defined by being alone, but by being different in a way that cannot easily be bridged. As this distance grows, responsibility begins to change as well, becoming something heavier and less clearly defined. Greater power brings greater influence, but it also brings consequences that extend further than before. Decisions that once affected only a small group now ripple outward, shaping larger outcomes, and the margin for error becomes smaller even as capability increases. This creates a form of pressure that is not always acknowledged, because while power provides control, it also increases expectation. The individual is no longer just acting within the system, but shaping it, influencing outcomes in ways that cannot always be predicted, and carrying the weight of those outcomes, whether they intended them or not. This complexity begins to affect decision-making itself, because as options expand, so does uncertainty. A stronger individual does not simply have more choices, but more variables to consider, more possible consequences to account for, and more ways for those consequences to unfold unexpectedly. This creates a situation where certainty becomes harder to maintain, not because the individual lacks understanding, but because the scale of their influence introduces outcomes that cannot always be controlled. Over time, this leads to a kind of hesitation that is not rooted in fear, but in awareness, a recognition that every action carries multiple possible results, and that not all of them can be anticipated, no matter how capable the individual becomes. There is also a deeper psychological shift that occurs as power continues to grow, one that is even harder to recognize because it develops gradually. The individual begins to see the world differently, not just in terms of capability, but in terms of structure. Patterns become clearer, systems become more transparent, and the limitations that once defined others begin to feel less relevant. This does not immediately create separation, but it introduces a subtle change in perspective, where the individual is no longer fully grounded in the same framework as those around them, seeing things from a position that is slightly removed from the shared experience of the system. As this perspective continues to shift, the connection between the individual and the system begins to weaken. Not in a dramatic or visible way, but in a quiet, gradual movement away from what once felt familiar. They are still part of the world, still interacting with it, still influencing it, but they are no longer fully shaped by it in the same way. The rules that once guided their decisions feel less restrictive. The structures that once defined their place feel less necessary. And over time, this creates a sense of distance that is difficult to reverse. This is where the cost of power becomes most difficult to define, because it is not something that can be measured directly. It is not a loss of strength or a visible consequence, but a shift in how the individual exists within the world. They become more capable, more influential, more free in a sense, but also less connected to the shared structure that gives meaning to those capabilities. And as that connection weakens, a quiet question begins to emerge beneath everything else. One that is rarely spoken, but always present. If power continues to grow, if it continues to move beyond the limits that once defined it, what remains to anchor the individual within the world? And what prevents that distance from becoming complete? Because once that separation is fully realized, once the individual is no longer grounded in the same system that shaped them, power is no longer just an increase in strength. It becomes something else entirely. A transformation that gives more, but slowly, almost invisibly, takes something away. The shinobi world often presents itself as something balanced, not in the sense of fairness, but in the sense that opposing forces exist to counter one another. That no matter how strong something becomes, there will always be something capable of resisting it. This idea appears consistently, woven into the structure of villages, alliances, and even individual rivalries, creating the impression that the system, despite its instability, is still held together by a kind of natural equilibrium. But when that balance is examined more closely, it begins to feel less like a stable design and more like something temporary, something maintained not by structure, but by coincidence and timing. At first, the balance seems real. The major villages exist as competing powers, each with their own strengths, their own leaders, and their own resources. And while conflict between them is common, there is an underlying sense that no single village can completely dominate the others without consequence. This creates a fragile form of stability, where power is distributed just enough to prevent any one force from overwhelming the rest. But this distribution is not as even as it appears, because much of it depends on a very small number of individuals, rather than the system as a whole. This is where the illusion begins to take shape, because the balance of the entire world often rests on the presence of a few exceptionally powerful shinobi, individuals whose strength acts as a counterweight to others of similar level. When those individuals exist simultaneously, the system appears stable. But when they do not, when one side gains an advantage that is not immediately matched, the balance begins to shift in ways that are difficult to control. This suggests that the system is not inherently balanced, but temporarily stabilized by the existence of equal forces. There is also something subtle in how conflict is resolved that reinforces this idea. Wars do not end because the system prevents them from continuing, but because the conditions that sustain them eventually change. Leaders are removed, alliances are restructured, or new forces emerge that alter the outcome. This creates the appearance of resolution, but it is not the result of a stable system correcting itself. It is the result of circumstances shifting until the conflict can no longer continue in the same way. The concept of rivalries introduces another layer to this illusion. Many of the most significant conflicts in Naruto are framed as personal oppositions, individuals whose strength and ideology place them against one another in ways that feel almost destined. Naruto and Sasuke, Hashirama and Madara. These pairings create the impression that balance is maintained through opposition, that for every force, there is another that exists to counter it. But this balance is not guaranteed. It is the result of specific individuals existing at the same time. And if even one part of that pairing is removed, the balance disappears with it. There is also an interesting detail in how power escalates over time. Each generation produces individuals who surpass the previous one, pushing the limits of what is possible further and further. This progression suggests growth, but it also introduces instability, because the system does not always adjust at the same rate. As power increases, the mechanisms that are meant to contain or balance it do not always evolve alongside it, creating gaps where the balance begins to break down. The existence of organizations like Akatsuki highlights this imbalance even further. These groups operate outside the traditional system, yet they are capable of challenging entire villages, suggesting that the established structure is not as secure as it appears. If a relatively small group can disrupt the balance so significantly, then the stability of the system is clearly dependent on factors that are not fully controlled. There is also something subtle in how peace is maintained. Periods of peace are often the result of exhaustion, of conflict reaching a point where continuation is no longer sustainable, rather than the result of a system designed to prevent conflict entirely. This means that peace is not a stable state, but a temporary condition, one that exists only until the next imbalance begins to form. The role of leadership adds another layer to this illusion. Strong leaders can maintain stability within their villages, guiding decisions and preventing unnecessary conflict. But this stability is tied to the individual rather than the system. When leadership changes, the conditions that maintained balance can change with it, suggesting that the system does not guarantee stability on its own. There is also an underlying assumption that strength will always be met with equal strength. But this is not always the case. There are moments where power emerges without an immediate counter, creating situations where the balance is disrupted before it can be restored. These moments reveal that the system does not inherently produce balance, but reacts to imbalance after it occurs. Even the idea of alliances reflects this instability. Villages form agreements, cooperate during larger conflicts, and present a united front when necessary. But these alliances are often temporary, shaped by immediate need rather than long-term structure. Once the conditions that created them change, the alliances themselves can dissolve, returning the system to its previous state of tension. And when all of these details are considered together, the idea of balance begins to feel less certain. It is not that balance does not exist at all, but that it is not as stable or as reliable as it appears. It is something that emerges under specific conditions, maintained by individuals, timing, and circumstance, rather than by a system that guarantees it. The shinobi world is not held together by perfect equilibrium. It is held together by moments where opposing forces happen to align just enough to prevent collapse. And when those moments pass, when the conditions that created that balance begin to shift, the illusion fades, revealing a system that is constantly adjusting, constantly reacting, and never fully stable, no matter how much it appears to be on the surface. Chakra is introduced early in Naruto as something that feels simple enough to understand, a mixture of physical and spiritual energy that fuels every technique, every movement, and every ability within the shinobi world. It is presented almost like a resource, something that can be trained, expanded, controlled, and eventually exhausted. And because it is explained in these terms, it becomes easy to accept without questioning it too deeply. But the longer the story continues, the more chakra begins to behave in ways that do not fully align with that explanation. And what once seemed like a clear system slowly becomes something far more difficult to define, something that exists at the center of everything, yet never fully settles into a single, consistent set of rules. At first, chakra appears to function like stamina, something that can be depleted through overuse, forcing shinobi to manage it carefully in order to remain effective. Early battles emphasize this clearly, where running out of chakra means losing the ability to continue fighting, creating a strong sense of limitation that shapes how characters approach conflict. But as the series progresses, this limitation becomes less consistent. Certain individuals begin to operate with reserves that feel almost endless, while others find ways to regenerate or supplement their chakra through external means, suggesting that chakra is not a fixed quantity, but something far more flexible, something that can expand beyond what the system initially implies. This flexibility becomes even more noticeable when chakra is shared between individuals. It can be transferred, distributed, and even synchronized across groups, allowing multiple people to draw from the same source in a way that blurs the boundary between individual and collective power. This raises an unusual implication, because if chakra can move so freely between people, then the idea that it belongs solely to one person begins to feel less certain. It suggests that chakra is not entirely bound to the individual, but can exist in a more fluid state, something that can connect rather than separate. There is also something deeper in how chakra changes form. Through nature transformation, it becomes fire, water, wind, earth, or lightning, each with its own behavior, its own interaction with the world, and its own strengths and weaknesses. This alone suggests that chakra is not just energy, but something capable of becoming entirely different substances depending on how it is shaped. And yet, even with this adaptability, individuals are said to have natural affinities, as if the way chakra expresses itself is influenced by something internal, something tied to identity, rather than just technique. The more this is considered, the more chakra begins to feel less like a resource and more like something that reflects the person using it. This becomes especially clear in how sensory-type shinobi perceive chakra. They do not just detect presence. They recognize individuals through it, distinguishing one person from another without ever seeing them. This implies that chakra carries a kind of signature, something unique to each individual, almost like an extension of their identity that exists beyond the physical body. There is also a quiet contradiction in how chakra interacts with the physical world. Techniques formed from chakra can create structures, barriers, and weapons that behave with solidity and consistency, interacting with objects as if they were made of matter rather than energy. This blurs the line between what is physical and what is not, suggesting that chakra, when refined enough, is not just a source of power, but a substance capable of taking on properties that should not belong to energy alone. Healing abilities introduce another layer that complicates the understanding of chakra even further. Chakra can be used to repair tissue, accelerate recovery, and even sustain life in situations where it would otherwise end. This implies that chakra is not separate from the body, but deeply integrated with it, functioning almost like an extension of life itself. It is not just something that powers actions, but something that maintains existence, connecting energy and biology in a way that is never fully explained. There is also something subtle in how chakra responds to emotion. Certain abilities grow stronger or weaker depending on the user's mental and emotional state, suggesting that chakra is influenced by more than just physical and spiritual components. It reacts to intention, to feeling, to internal shifts that are not always visible. This makes chakra feel less like a neutral resource and more like something responsive, something that changes based on the person using it in ways that are not always predictable. The concept of control adds yet another dimension. Having large reserves of chakra does not guarantee effectiveness, because without precise control, that power becomes difficult to use. This creates a balance between quantity and refinement, where mastery is defined not by how much chakra someone possesses, but by how well they can shape it. Over time, this reinforces the idea that chakra is not just about capacity, but about understanding, about the ability to interact with something that is constantly shifting between states. There is also an interesting implication in how chakra can be concealed or suppressed. Shinobi can hide their presence by reducing or masking their chakra, suggesting that it is not always actively expressed, but can exist in a controlled, minimized state. This creates a situation where what is perceived is not always the full reality, adding another layer of uncertainty to how chakra is understood and detected. In extreme situations, chakra behaves even more unpredictably. It can surge, transform, or take on entirely new properties under pressure, suggesting that its limits are not fixed, but responsive to conditions. This creates the sense that chakra evolves alongside the individual, changing not just in quantity, but in nature, as if it is something that adapts rather than something that remains constant. And when all of these details are placed together, chakra begins to feel less like a clearly defined system, and more like something that exists between categories, something that is energy, identity, connection, and substance all at once. It follows rules, but not always consistently. It can be controlled, but never fully understood. And the deeper it is examined, the more it begins to feel like something that was never meant to be explained completely, only used. Something that sits at the center of the shinobi world, not as a fixed foundation, but as something far more fluid, far more complex, and far less certain than it first appears. There are moments throughout Naruto that are meant to feel intense, dramatic, and decisive. Moments where the outcome of a battle seems clear, where the damage dealt appears final. and where the story briefly allows itself to reach the edge of consequence. But when those moments are looked at more closely, a pattern begins to emerge, one that is easy to overlook because it is so consistent. Characters survive things they should not survive, recover from situations that should leave permanent consequences, and continue forward in ways that quietly reshape what danger is supposed to mean in this world. At first, this can be explained through resilience. Shinobi are trained to endure, to push through pain, and to continue fighting even when their bodies are under extreme stress. This is part of their identity, part of what separates them from ordinary individuals. But there is a difference between endurance and survival beyond what the body should allow, and that line is crossed more often than it is acknowledged. Injuries that should incapacitate instead become temporary obstacles. Damage that should carry lasting consequence is recovered from. And over time, this creates a subtle shift in how the body itself is understood. One of the clearest examples of this is how characters continue to fight after sustaining injuries that would realistically end any engagement. Deep wounds, broken bones, and extreme physical strain are often treated as something that can be pushed through with enough willpower. But this raises an interesting implication. The body, in the shinobi world, does not function as a strict limitation in the same way it does in reality. It is influenced, supported, and in some cases, overridden by chakra, allowing it to operate beyond what should be physically possible. This becomes even more apparent when considering recovery. Healing in Naruto is not always immediate, but it is often far more efficient than expected. Characters return from injuries that should take far longer to resolve, suggesting that the body's ability to repair itself is enhanced in ways that are never fully explained. This implies that chakra is not just used for techniques, but constantly interacting with the body, reinforcing it, maintaining it, and allowing it to recover at a rate that feels unnatural when compared to normal biological processes. There is also something subtle in how fatigue is portrayed. Early in the series, exhaustion is treated as a significant factor, limiting how long a character can fight and how effectively they can use their abilities. But as the story progresses, this limitation becomes less consistent. Characters engage in prolonged battles, using high-level techniques repeatedly, yet continue to function at a level that does not fully reflect the level of strain they should be under. This suggests that endurance, like strength, becomes something that can expand beyond its original limits. The existence of healing techniques introduces another layer to this pattern. Medical ninjutsu allows injuries to be treated during or after combat, reducing the long-term impact of damage that would otherwise be permanent. But even this does not fully account for everything, because there are moments where survival occurs without immediate intervention, where the body endures conditions that should not allow recovery at all. There is also an interesting detail in how characters react to damage. Pain is acknowledged, but it rarely dictates action. Shinobi continue to move, to fight, and to make decisions even when their bodies are clearly compromised, suggesting that their relationship with pain is fundamentally different. It is not something that stops them, but something that exists alongside their actions, influencing but not controlling them. This pattern becomes even more noticeable in high-level battles, where the scale of attacks increases dramatically. Explosions, large-scale techniques, and direct impacts that should have devastating consequences are often survived, sometimes with minimal lasting effect. This creates a shift in how danger is perceived, because what should be final becomes survivable, and what should be rare becomes expected. There is also something worth considering about how close characters come to death without crossing that line. Many moments are framed as near fatal, yet the outcome stops just short, as if there is an invisible boundary that is approached but not fully reached. This creates a sense that survival is not just a matter of chance, but something that is influenced by factors beyond what is shown directly. The concept of willpower is often used to explain these moments. The idea that determination can push someone beyond their limits, allowing them to continue when they otherwise could not. While this is a central theme, it also suggests that the body's limits are not fixed, but can be influenced by internal state, by belief, by intention in a way that is never fully defined. There is also a subtle inconsistency in how long-term consequences are handled. While some injuries leave lasting effects, many do not, allowing characters to return to full capability after events that should have permanent impact. This creates a world where damage exists, but does not always accumulate in the way it would in reality. The presence of external factors, such as chakra from others, healing abilities, or unique conditions, often contributes to survival. But even when these are absent, the pattern remains. Characters endure, recover, and continue in ways that suggest that survival itself operates differently within the shinobi world. And when all of these moments are considered together, a quiet conclusion begins to form. The body, in Naruto, is not a fixed limitation. It is something that can be extended, supported, and in some cases, surpassed entirely. Survival is not always determined by what should happen, but by what the system allows to happen. And over time, this changes how danger itself is understood. Because when the impossible becomes survivable, the meaning of consequence begins to shift. Time in Naruto is almost never questioned directly, because it appears to function like time always does, moving forward, marking growth, separating past from present, and giving structure to everything that happens. But the more closely you look, the more that sense of consistency begins to fade, because time, in this world, does not behave as something completely fixed. It stretches in certain moments, compresses in others, and sometimes feels as though it is being experienced differently, depending on who is within it. This is never explained outright, but it becomes increasingly noticeable the longer you pay attention to how events unfold, especially in moments where the difference between what should happen and what is actually happening begins to widen. One of the most obvious distortions appears during combat, where time seems to expand far beyond what should be possible. In the middle of extremely fast exchanges, characters are able to think through multiple possibilities, analyze their opponent's movements, predict outcomes, and adjust their actions accordingly, all within what should be a fraction of a second. Entire strategies unfold internally, while externally, almost nothing has changed. This suggests that time is not being experienced at a uniform rate, but is instead shaped by awareness, where highly trained shinobi are able to process information at a level that effectively slows time from their perspective, even though it continues moving normally for everything else. This creates a subtle separation between perception and reality. The physical world continues at its usual pace, but the internal experience of time becomes extended, allowing decisions that should not be possible within such short intervals. Over time, this suggests that combat is not just about speed or strength, but about how time itself is experienced within the moment, where the difference between victory and defeat is often determined by how much can be understood within a space that should be too small to contain that understanding. There is also something unusual in how quickly characters grow, especially when compared to how much time actually passes. Skills that should require years of refinement are often developed within significantly shorter periods. And while this is sometimes explained through intense training or natural talent, it still creates a quiet inconsistency. Growth in Naruto does not always align with the passage of time, suggesting that time, in terms of development, is not a strict measure, but something that can be compressed under the right conditions. Training methods reinforce this idea even further. Certain techniques allow individuals to accelerate their learning, to experience more within less time, effectively multiplying the amount of progress they can achieve without increasing the duration itself. This creates a situation where time is not directly altered, but its value is, where one unit of time can produce far more outcome than it normally should. Over time, this introduces the idea that time is not just something that passes, but something that can be used more efficiently depending on how it is approached. There is also a subtle inconsistency in how long events feel compared to how long they actually last. Some battles appear to stretch across extended periods, with multiple phases and shifts in momentum. Yet within those same battles, characters maintain a level of focus and clarity that would be difficult to sustain over such durations. This suggests that time, as it is experienced within intense situations, does not always align with its external measurement, creating a disconnect between what is happening and how it is perceived. Memory introduces another layer to this distortion, because past experiences in Naruto are not simply left behind. They are revisited, reinterpreted, and brought into the present in ways that make them feel immediate, almost as if they are happening alongside current events, rather than existing separately. This creates a blending of time where the past continues to influence the present in a very direct way, reducing the sense of distance between what has already happened and what is happening now. There is also something worth noticing about how age and maturity relate to time. Characters who are relatively young often display levels of understanding, composure, and strategic thinking that seem far beyond what their age would suggest. This implies that time, in terms of experience, is not measured simply by years, but by intensity, by exposure to conflict, and by the accumulation of moments that shape perception more rapidly than normal life would allow. The existence of space-time techniques introduces perhaps the most direct contradiction to the idea of time as something fixed. Abilities that allow instantaneous movement, access to separate dimensions, or the storage of objects outside of normal space all suggest that time is not an absolute boundary, but something that can be bypassed or ignored under certain conditions. These techniques do not just move through time differently. They remove the need to interact with it in the usual way, creating moments where distance and duration no longer apply. There is also an interesting pattern in how long-term plans are constructed. Certain characters act based on outcomes that will not occur for years, setting events in motion that unfold gradually, as if they are operating with a perspective that extends beyond the immediate present. This creates the sense that time, for some individuals, is not something they react to, but something they anticipate and shape, treating the future as something that can be influenced long before it arrives. The pacing of the world itself reinforces this inconsistency. Periods of relative calm can last for extended stretches, with little visible change, while moments of intense conflict can alter the entire structure of the world in a very short time. This uneven distribution creates the impression that time does not move evenly, but accelerates and slows depending on what is happening, shaping the world in bursts rather than through a steady progression. There is also something subtle in how quickly information moves and is acted upon. Decisions are made, strategies are adjusted, and responses are executed with a speed that suggests a level of efficiency that is not always shown, but constantly implied. This creates the sense that time, in terms of reaction, is compressed, allowing the world to respond faster than it should. And when all of these details are considered together, time in Naruto begins to feel less like a constant, and more like something that adapts to the needs of the moment. It stretches, when complexity is required, compresses when action demands speed, and shifts in ways that allow characters to exist within moments that should be too small to contain what they experience. It is not that time is broken. It is that it is flexible. And the deeper you look, the more it begins to feel like something that is not entirely fixed, but shaped by perception, by ability, and by the intensity of the world itself, quietly adjusting without ever needing to explain how or why it moves the way it does. There is a quiet assumption that runs through the entirety of Naruto, one that is rarely acknowledged because it is never directly challenged. The world functions. Missions are assigned. Villages operate. Systems remain in place. And despite the constant presence of conflict, everything continues to move forward in a way that feels stable enough to accept. But when you begin to look more closely, that sense of stability starts to feel less like something inherent to the world itself, and more like something that is maintained through acceptance, through the absence of deeper questioning. The system works, not necessarily because it is perfect, but because those within it rarely stop to examine the parts that do not fully make sense. From the very beginning, shinobi are placed into a structure that defines their role, their purpose, and their path forward. They are trained within a system that emphasizes obedience, hierarchy, and function. And over time, this becomes the framework through which they understand everything else. Missions are given, orders are followed, and outcomes are measured based on success or failure, creating a clear and efficient cycle that reinforces itself. But within that cycle, there are elements that, if examined too closely, begin to reveal inconsistencies that are never fully addressed. One of the most significant of these is the way missions themselves are structured. Shinobi are assigned tasks that range from simple to life-threatening, often with very little context beyond what is necessary to complete the objective. The system assumes that execution is more important than understanding, that the role of a shinobi is to act, not to question. This creates efficiency, but it also creates distance, because the consequences of those actions are not always fully considered by those carrying them out. There is also something subtle in how authority is accepted. Leaders make decisions that affect entire villages, sometimes entire regions, and those decisions are rarely challenged openly, even when their consequences are severe. This suggests that the system relies heavily on trust, or perhaps on the conditioning that discourages questioning authority altogether. The structure remains stable, not because every decision is correct, but because the process of decision-making itself is rarely disrupted. The existence of organizations like ANBU and Root highlights this dynamic even further. These groups operate in secrecy, carrying out actions that are intentionally hidden from the rest of the population, suggesting that there are layers of the system that function outside of normal visibility. Their presence implies that not everything within the world is meant to be understood, that some aspects are deliberately kept beyond scrutiny in order to maintain stability. There is also an interesting detail in how information is controlled. Certain events are widely known, while others remain obscured, mentioned only in fragments, or not at all. This selective flow of information shapes perception, influencing how individuals understand the world without ever revealing the full picture. It creates a version of reality that is consistent enough to accept, even if it is not complete. The relationship between clans and villages adds another layer to this quiet acceptance. Clans carry their own histories, their own identities, and sometimes their own agendas. Yet they exist within a larger system that requires alignment. Conflicts arise when these layers do not match. But even then, the system absorbs those conflicts, continuing forward without fully resolving the underlying tension. There is also something worth noticing about how quickly individuals adapt to the structure they are placed in. From a young age, shinobi learn what is expected of them, and over time, those expectations become internalized to the point where they are no longer questioned. The system does not need to enforce itself constantly because it has already shaped the mindset of those within it. The idea of peace, when it appears, follows a similar pattern. It is not always the result of a perfect system functioning as intended, but often the result of temporary alignment, where conditions happen to favor stability. And when those conditions change, conflict returns, not because the system failed suddenly, but because it was never fully stable to begin with. There is also a deeper implication in how contradictions are handled. Moments that do not fully align with the established rules are often accepted without much resistance, integrated into the narrative without requiring full explanation. This suggests that consistency is not maintained through strict logic, but through acceptance, through a willingness to allow certain details to remain unresolved. Even the most powerful individuals, those who have the ability to reshape the system entirely, often operate within it rather than completely outside of it. They challenge it, influence it, and sometimes bend it, but rarely dismantle it entirely. This reinforces the idea that the system persists not because it cannot be changed, but because it is rarely questioned deeply enough to require that change. And when all of these elements are considered together, a quiet realization begins to form. The shinobi world does not function because it is perfectly constructed. It functions because those within it accept it, because they move through it without stopping to examine every inconsistency, every contradiction, every detail that does not fully align. It is a system held together by participation, by trust, by habit, and perhaps most importantly, by the absence of deeper questioning. Because if those within it were to stop, to look more closely, to ask why things are the way they are. The stability that seems so natural might begin to feel far less certain. And the world, as it exists, might not hold together in quite the same way. By the time everything is considered together, the abilities, the system, the psychology, the way power grows, the way time shifts, and the way the world continues to function, despite its inconsistencies, there is a quiet realization that begins to take shape beneath all of it. Not something sudden or dramatic, but something gradual, something that emerges only when enough pieces are observed at once. The truth about the shinobi world is not that it is perfectly designed, or even that it is fully explainable, but that it exists in a state where explanation is never the priority, where function matters more than understanding, and where the deeper you look, the less certain everything begins to feel. At first, everything seems structured. Chakra has rules, villages have systems, power has limits, and time moves forward in a way that appears consistent enough to follow. But each of these elements, when examined individually, begins to show small fractures, small inconsistencies that are easy to ignore on their own, but become more noticeable when they are placed side by side. Chakra behaves like energy, but also like identity. Power increases capability, but also creates distance. The system maintains order, but only because it is rarely questioned. Time moves forward, but is experienced differently depending on awareness and intensity. None of these contradictions break the world entirely, but they prevent it from being fully understood. This creates a kind of quiet uncertainty, because the world is not unstable in a way that causes it to collapse, but it is not stable in a way that can be fully explained either. It exists in a space between those two states, where everything functions, but not always for reasons that are clear. And over time, this suggests that the shinobi world is not something that is meant to be understood completely, but something that is meant to be experienced, navigated, and accepted. There is also something deeper in how individuals relate to this uncertainty. Shinobi are not taught to question the system at its core, not because they are incapable of doing so, but because their role within it does not require that level of understanding. They are trained to act, to adapt, to survive, and to fulfill their purpose within the structure they are given. This creates a mindset where function replaces explanation, where knowing how to do something is valued more than knowing why it works. Over time, this way of thinking becomes so natural that the need for deeper understanding begins to fade. The system continues to operate, individuals continue to grow, and the world continues to move forward, all without requiring every detail to be fully resolved. This does not mean that the contradictions disappear, but that they are absorbed into the way the world is experienced, becoming part of its normal state rather than something that needs to be corrected. There is also an interesting detail in how those who do question the system are treated. Individuals who begin to look beyond the surface, who try to understand the deeper structure of the world, often find themselves separated from it in some way. They step outside the accepted framework, and in doing so, they lose the stability that comes with remaining within it. This suggests that understanding, while valuable, also carries a kind of risk, because it disrupts the balance that allows the system to function smoothly. The idea of truth itself becomes less clear in this context. If the world functions without requiring full understanding, then truth is no longer something that needs to be fully revealed. It becomes something partial, something that exists in fragments, accessible only in certain moments, but never entirely at once. This creates a situation where different individuals can understand different parts of the system without ever seeing the whole, each perspective valid, but incomplete. There is also something subtle in how meaning is created within this world. Meaning does not come from perfect understanding, but from action, from connection, and from the way individuals choose to exist within the system they are given. This suggests that meaning is not dependent on clarity, but on experience, on the way events are interpreted rather than fully explained. As all of these elements come together, the idea of a complete explanation begins to feel less necessary. The world does not need to be fully understood in order to function, and perhaps it was never designed to be. It exists in a way that allows for movement, for change, for growth, without requiring every detail to align perfectly. And this leads to a final, quieter realization, one that sits beneath everything else without demanding attention. The truth about the shinobi world is not something that can be fully uncovered, not because it is hidden, but because it does not exist as a single, complete answer. It exists in fragments, in patterns, in contradictions that are allowed to remain unresolved. It is a world that works, not because everything makes sense, but because it does not need to. And in that way, it becomes something that is not defined by certainty, but by acceptance, something that continues to exist, to move, and to evolve without ever fully revealing everything that holds it together, leaving just enough unknown to ensure that it never becomes completely understood.